You were never meant to survive. So now that you know that truth, what will you do? How will you choose to fight for yourself, your needs, and your communities? What will you refuse to fight for? Alafia, and welcome back to Black Love Free, a spiritual political podcast dedicated to Black spirituality, healing, and Black liberation. I am your host, Brendan, a reluctant anthropologist, hoodoo, student of the Ifa Orisha Isheshe tradition, and an energy healer. So, yeah, I've been missing. I've been MIA for a minute. And to be honest, it's purely because I have been entirely too busy between my job and the workshops that we're doing with our learning community and just other things as well. And so, yeah, I won't offer many apologies, mainly because I had to come to the realization that I'm actually just not a content creator. I do a lot of shit. So I have some tea here with me. This tea is hibiscus and rose and raw honey, and it's so good. So I'm hopeful that this episode will make up for missing Hoodoo Heritage Month and Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. If we've learned anything over these past few weeks is that we actually need to save ourselves. The government is doing what governments want to do, right? We are seeing empire in its collapse. And I'd like to say that if it's any time to learn how to save yourself right now, honey, this is it. Any time to understand and to know your life as something that should be saved by any means necessary, this is it. That doesn't mean, though, that you have to do it alone. I don't think that I would be here or and would be able to celebrate my life, able to celebrate the beauty of it, even in the midst of trials and tribulations, as they say. Right. And this is just purely because of the community, the love and the support that I have. And so I want to say thank you to everyone who supported the podcast so far, folks who support me, whether that's through donating to us through our website, by listening, by sending the podcast or our materials to folks that you know need a little something, something, coming to our workshops, leaving a good review on Apple Podcasts, or I know some folks are not using Spotify anymore, wherever you listen to your podcast, right? Following us on Instagram, following us on Substack, right? And responding to our Instagram prompts every day through the care, the kindness, the support that you show me, right? You demonstrate that we are the ones who will save us. And so if you see me reaching over here, it's because I'm reading a script, and so I gotta keep scrolling just to let you know. And like outside of just like trying to survive too, I've been doing some fun stuff. I have gone on some really bad dates since the last time I've been in front of the mic. I've also gone on a good one, but things still did not end well. And you know, I would think it was me if it was me, but I don't know, maybe that's a subject for a different episode. Because today we are talking about vulnerability, visibility, and grief as parts of our deepening commitment to ruthless self devotion. So we'll be reading Audre Lorde and we'll be reading Asada Shakur and reflecting on the vulnerability that we need in order to survive. So, as usual, I want you to join me in a collective breath, right? We're getting ready to clear the air for these definitions that will come to us. So, on the count of three, I invite you to take a breath with me. One, two, three. Ooh, I need to take another one. One, two, three. With this breath, we are making space for a new understanding of visibility and vulnerability. And that undoubtedly comes with some shame. And so, as you think through the rest of this episode, as you listen, I invite you to release that shame or at least note it. If releasing feels a little scary, which it definitely can, right? Note it when it comes. And one day, right, you will invite it to leave. We actually have two different words today. So I'm going to start with vulnerability and then I'll move to visibility because these are definitely interconnected. So, vulnerability, according to dictionary.com, means the following: it is the openness or susceptibility to attack or harm. It is the willingness to show emotion or to allow one's weaknesses to be seen or known. It is the willingness to risk being emotionally hurt. Vulnerability is also the condition of needing supportive or protective social services and community resources because of advanced age, poverty, disability, etc. And so, if you think about these definitions, right, you can mark some differences between them. The first couple are much more on a kind of individual or interpersonal level, right? The openness or susceptibility to attack or harm. That tends to be the kind of interpersonal understanding of vulnerability, right? A group of people might be vulnerable or open to attack or harm, but we tend to think of that like on the more visceral or body level, as well as a willingness to show emotion or allow one's weaknesses to be seen or known, right? The willingness to be emotionally hurt that tends to occur on a more interpersonal level. But then what's really interesting in that last definition is that vulnerability takes on a structural stance, right? And so in my work, I talk a lot about the structural vulnerability of Black women, of survivors of sexual and domestic violence, in particular, the ways that Blackness is a structurally vulnerable positionality. What's interesting is that these meanings seem to inflect a certain kind of wrongness with vulnerability, right? There's maybe that second one, right? The willingness to show emotion, the willingness to risk being emotionally hurt. Maybe that one's not necessarily seen as wrong, but the other ones seem like there's a kind of wrongness or disconnect to vulnerability. But if we think about vulnerability and we break it down, we see that the root of the English word vulnerable is Latin. And it's been 20 years since I took Latin. I took Latin in middle school. And so I'm not going to pronounce this in the way that they would, but vulnerabilis, right? Which means injurious or wounding. And it is equivalent to the Latin vulnerare, which means to wound, plus the suffix bilis or bull, right? And that is to take the ability of. And so if we take the word at its root, right, vulnerability is actually the ability to be wounded. And it is only in a capitalist, cis heteropatriarchal, ableist, anti Black, white supremacist world order that the ability to be wounded is a shameful thing. And you can even see this in the synonyms of the words that are associated with it, right? Weakness, susceptibility, liability, subjection, etc. It's clear that in the current social order that we're in, vulnerability is not usually seen as a positive thing. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If we think about white supremacy, if your culture is built upon power gained through dominion, wanton violence, genocide, sexual assault, rape, etc., then yes, to be woundable is a sin, right? To be able to be hurt is a sin in a world in which domination is what makes you powerful. To be woundable is to be close to death. And we've already talked about on this podcast, right, how our oppressors feel about death. We've also talked about this on the podcast before, that there is no shame in someone hurting us. There is no shame in being oppressed. That shame that we feel or that we might feel being oppressed is being offloaded onto us, right, from our oppressor. The shameful thing is to need to oppress people to have what you need, right? The shameful thing is to have to dominate and harm and wound others to feel safe. The shame that we might feel about our vulnerability, whether it be structural because we're Black or woman or trans or child or poor, right? The shame that we might feel about that structural form of vulnerability or even those interpersonal forms of vulnerability. It's important for us to understand, right, that shame that we feel about our vulnerability in all of its different facets actually belongs to the persons or the institutions that would harm us. And I know by now you're like, girl, we minutes in and you still talking about this. Like, why in the hell is this relevant and necessary in a practice of ruthless self-devotion? So I'll tell you. So visibility, right, is something that we're going to hold alongside vulnerability today. Visibility, according to dictionary.com, it means the following. It is the state or fact of being visible. It is the relative ability to be seen under given conditions of distance, light, atmosphere, etc. It was first recorded, according to dictionary.com, it was first recorded in 1300, 1350, back when the Dark Ages was going on. They didn't know how to wash. So visibility was really important. And it is from the Latin word visibilis, from visus, which is means to be seen, plus ibilis, which is able. And so what's important to hold from this definition of visibility is that visibility is relative. It is dependent upon the conditions in which you choose to see. So, depending on the distance, the light, the atmosphere, the presence of other things in that atmosphere, you might not be able to be seen or be visible, both literally, figuratively, and symbolically. So, why do we pull these two things together? Well, the main reason why is because Audre Lorde did it. And she talks about the life saving role of visibility in our lives in her paper, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. She delivered this paper at the Modern Language Association's Lesbian and Literature panel in Chicago, Illinois, on December 28th, 1977. In her talk, she brings together vulnerability and visibility, illustrating why they are essential for our resistance practices. She begins, quote, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood, that the speaking profits me beyond any other effect. And she notes that she arrives to that point after facing the near certain fact of her death by cancer. She had a tumor that was actually confirmed to be benign after the surgery. They had to remove it. And so she spent about 3 weeks rearranging her life upon finding out that she might have cancer. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Something as devastating as that. You have to change who you are and how you live your life. But in that space of reflection and rearrangement, she learned what was most important to her. As she reflected over her life, she watched it like a movie. I could imagine she was watching it like a movie. And she said that her biggest regrets or her biggest regrets were her silences. And she says, of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death. But we all hurt in so many ways all the time. And pain will either change or end. But death, on the other hand, is the final silence. And that might be coming quickly now, without regard for whether I had ever spoken what needed to be said or had only betrayed myself into small silences while I planned someday to speak or wait for someone else's words, a savior. And I begin to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is more desirable not to be afraid, learning to put fear into a perspective gave me great strength. I was going to die, if not sooner than later. whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. She then goes on to say that when she had spoken, it had allowed her to bridge differences with other women. Lord does a lot of talking about relating to white women, and that could probably be because of her own personal proclivities, right? But what's important to note here is that she was thinking and reflecting in that moment of looking and facing death and thinking about the fear that she held around being visible and being vulnerable. She talks about fear being the main impetus or reason for her silence, the state from which we can feign that we are not vulnerable. And in this silence, right, we can pretend like we do not have the ability to be wounded. But we all know what Zora Neale Hurston says about silence, right? If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say that you enjoyed it. But Audrey has something I think to also add to this conversation around silence. And she says, quote, "In the cause of silence, each of us draws the face of her own fear, fear of contempt, of censure, of some judgment or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation. But most of all, I think, we fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. Within this country where racial differences creates a constant, if unspoken, distortion of vision, Black women have on one hand always been highly visible, and so on the other hand have been rendered invisible through the depersonalization of racism. Even within the women's movement, we've had to fight, and still do, for that very visibility, which also renders us most vulnerable, our Blackness. For to survive in the mouth of this dragon we call America, we've had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings, and neither were most of you here today, Black or not. And that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength, because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners mute forever while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. So then, what do we do with the fear? Lord advises, quote, "We can learn to work and speak when we are afraid in the same way we have learned to work and speak when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. So essentially, the only way to work out of our fear is to speak, is to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and visible at the same time, is to allow ourselves to recognize our strengths alongside our ability to be wounded, because that is what allows us to be alive. That is what allows us to be. We will definitely come back to this essay for our closing reflections in the Living in Alignment section, because Gamba Adisa, which is Audre Lorde's other name, poses some excellent provocations that will allow us to really think deeply about how to practice being vulnerable and being visible altogether. Because we're going to need that in order to survive fascism. One other thing to note, right, because I'm sure some of you might be wondering, okay, well, what do we do with the systems that already exist? What do we do with what is already here, what is already present? And I want to say that the systems that we live in offer representation as a substitute for visibility. And particularly, they offer this capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal form of representation through celebrity, through politicians, through a certain kind of vanguard, in order to give us a fake little substitute that don't even taste that good. It's like, what's that? The off-brand of Splenda instead of sugar. Like, aspartame or whatever it's called. I know it's called aspartame. Like, it's like that. Offering that and that causes cancer and, like, not giving you what you need to be nourished, right? In all seriousness, this visibility is very frightening, like, to be vulnerable here in this moment, right? I never, ever imagined doing a podcast where people could actually see me. I liked the idea of folks just hearing my voice, never seeing my face, and part of that was because of how I felt about the way I looked, and because of the insecurities I had about my looks, about what others would say about me, as someone who's not light skinned, as someone who is not thin, as someone who is, I have just a series of insecurities, right? And then the days where I show up and I don't feel like putting on makeup, like the days where I don't feel like doing all the things to perform for uh the quote unquote visibility that um that YouTube or Instagram sometimes requires. It is frightening to me because I have experienced violence. I've experienced things that would make me want to recoil and not be seen by others in the world. So I can feel that fear. I can affirm that. I still get nervous or afraid when I have to share parts of myself that I would rather stay hidden, usually in friendship and partnership with others. I feel most vulnerable when I have to share that something hurts me. But that vulnerability has taught me a lot. I've learned through the hardships of my life, even the wounding that comes, that can come by allowing myself to be seen, um, is necessary. Because if I am not visible, if others can't see me and know me, if there's too much in the atmosphere around me, if I'm cloaking the essence of who I am too much from others, then I can't receive the love and the support that I need to survive the death dealing conditions of anti Black capitalism. People will be caring for the cloak and not me. And at the ripe, young, old age of 32, I just have gotten to a point in my life where I want to be cared for. Not the cloak, not the mask. I want to be loved and cared for as I am. For that is the only way I could survive. The mask, Brendan, the hyper independent, the strong, the person who could do it all by herself and not need anyone, was not receiving the love that she needed to survive. And I was slowly but surely submitting to the end that my oppressors wanted for me. Our oppressors want that for all of us, right? They understand the importance of visibility and vulnerability to survival, which is why they offer the poor substitute, the aspartame, a substitute of representation. Representation tells us that our needs are met because the exception, the representative, is hypervisible and maybe has access to privilege, power, and capital. And we can think about it. We have these public officials who are representatives, right? They are supposed to make our needs known and visible. They're supposed to be the ones who fight for us to be able to eat and have clean water and clean air, be able to travel or do the things that we see fit. What happens is the representative has their needs met, right? The senator, the governor, the house member, the mayor, the representative has their needs met, right? They, as that symbol, that exception, right? They get to benefit from the exploitation inherent in capitalism. And we still go without. Like, we quite literally saw this happen, right? Congress is debating about whether people can eat. And people are going without, while their representatives that they voted for, that they used the power, the quote unquote, God given power that they have, right, to elect. Oof, let me get off my soapbox. And unless we are in upper class or we're not dependent upon the government that we should be dependent upon, right? If you believe in that, your needs aren't met. Capitalism plays mind games, right? It plays these mind games through this false scarcity that's created because the food exists, the money for the food exists. So the scarcity is false. This need for a representative is manufactured through that false scarcity, right? There's not enough time or energy or etc. for folks to be able to meet their own needs, right? Because of capitalism, because you have to work, because you have to eat, because you have to do all these other things that are extracted and disconnected from how we actually truly can live and survive. So capitalism has that false scarcity that is quote unquote solved through the representative. And then it presents these dreams of ascension also through that representative, right? So because Barack Obama exists and was president, you don't have to worry about not having food on your table. And I'm going to leave that there, right? So as we think through what we are demanding of our governments, what we're demanding of our communities, what we're demanding of each other moving forward, we have to think about what are the conditions that we can create for ourselves and for each other, where we can be ruthlessly devoted to ourselves, ruthlessly devoted to the creation of conditions in which we can be vulnerable and visible and safe. Visibility is a core need of being recognized, and it can only truly happen in safe, supportive community. That community sees you, right, in the truth of who you are, without refraction, without all that atmospheric junk, right, without representative, and can meet your need. So, I thought that it would be appropriate actually for us to spend some time with Asada Shakur's autobiography for today's episode. So, for our testimony section today, we're going to be reading from Asada, an autobiography, which was published in 1987. I have it right here. I have so many things to say about this. I'm hoping that we don't dawdle too long, but forgive me because as you can see, the nerd, she popped out. The nerd popped out all the post-it notes I have. So I'm not going to be able to do like a complete, thorough reading of the book. I'm going to try to keep it cute and keep it to the highlights that I found from her work. I'm going to try my best. But just for those of you who might not know who Asada Shakur, wow, I was going to say is, who she was. Asada Shakur, whose slave name was Joanne Cherismart, was a member of the Black Panther Party, but later left the party and joined the Black Liberation Army. She was a political prisoner in the U.S. who escaped capture. And in 2013, she earned the quote unquote honor of being the first woman on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. And after escaping prison, she lived out the rest of her days in exile in Cuba. Asada secured this plane on September 25th, 2025. And she did not die free, but at least she did not die imprisoned. And so there's that song. Oh, they never got her. Hey, oh, Sada. Mm-hmm. They never got her. Ooh, oh, Sada. Yeah, they never got her. Ooh, oh, Sada. Mm-hmm. They never got her. Oh, yeah. I said Asada. Mm, mm. They never got you. I think I'll start with my own discovery story of how I encountered Asada. I was 22, so it's about 10 years ago, and I was teaching high school at a place that I hated. I hated working there. I cried every day going into work and cried every day leaving. And it wasn't the kids at all. It wasn't the kids, it was the adults, it was the environment. I was too young and too unprepared, is the nicest word I could say. Too young and too unprepared for what I would experience and face. And so I was just depressed. And I was also in an abusive romantic relationship at the time as well. And I was desperately trying to make some meaning out of my life and out of what I was doing because it just felt hopeless. And for those of you who might have taught in public schools with under-resourced, those Title I under-resourced schools with lackluster leadership and lackluster is really the nicest fucking thing, like incompetent leadership, you might understand what I'm saying. I understand what I mean. But I was just like, fuck, like, how do I make sense out of this fucking life? And my best friend, Destiny, she suggested that I read Audre Lorde's Zombie, a biomythography. One night I was just like, okay, I can't sleep. I literally like couldn't sleep. I was so depressed and so upset with myself and with life. And so I was like, let me take Destiny. She's always right. So let me take her up on her suggestions. And even though I had to get to my job at 6:45 a.m. and I stayed up until about 2 or 3 in the morning, literally devouring the text. I was like reading it under my covers on my phone. If you can imagine reading a book on your phone. And I was eating that shit up, honey. I was eating that shit up. Let's just say I left Audre Lorde's book with clarity and affirmation that I'm queer. Okay. I was rereading them parts about her getting with women like, is this what it's like? And I left that being like, okay, I'm queer. I needed to explore this aspect of myself or at least accept it because I was in an abusive relationship with a cis man and I needed to be less depressed. I had to accept the fact that I wasn't just into men in order to survive. And so one night, I'm up till 2, 3 in the morning reading that. I go to work feeling a little better. I come back. I'm like, "Ooh, let me read again. Let me go back to my childhood coping mechanism of reading." And I don't really know how or why, and I think Destiny again might have suggested this to me, but I started reading Asada Shakur's autobiography under my covers in the same way. And so I found these two texts together, and through them, I was able to find different pieces of myself. My first time coming to Asada Shakur's autobiography, I was broken. I was depressed. I was trying to understand commitments that I had. I was like burnt out from certain kinds of organizing and just walked away from that. Like it was a lot. And so I came to her autobiography looking for a series of answers to the question, what is a revolutionary and how can I be one? And to be frank, I didn't know who she was. Like I was like, I don't know who Sada Shakur is. I grew up in South Carolina, okay? And my South Carolina education and the cult upbringing that I had didn't expose me to ideas of Black radicalism. I developed my radicalism organically in college and after college. I mean, it started in high school with my senior thesis project, and I was a nerd, so I did a senior thesis project on colorism and trying to eliminate colorism in my high school. But yeah, being a radical, having like a radical understanding of Black politics and Black Black life, that didn't come to me until college and after college. But anyway, those late nights readings brought me to a new understanding of myself, one where I could bring together my deep desire to change the world and myself, and my desire to love in a non normative way. So, in short, I am indebted to Asada Shakur for my becoming. How this work? Without her work, without her sacrifice, without her own practice of ruthless self devotion, I wouldn't be sitting here at this mic reading these texts, teaching what I teach. I probably would still be living a liberal life like the folks that we've seen online saying they love Asada but don't live by the values that she espoused in her work. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, the book begins with two forewords, one written by Angela Davis and the other by S. Lennox S. Hines. They both contextualize and lay out the political stakes of Asada's revolutionary work. And so Angela Davis, I'm quoting from her foreword, says, quote, when Richard Nixon raised the slogan of law and order in the 1970s, it was used in part to discredit the Black liberation movement and to justify the deployment of police, courts, and prisons against key figures in this and other radical movements of that era. As you follow her life story, you will discover a compassionate human being with an unswerving commitment to justice that travels easily across racial and ethnic lines, in and out of prison and across oceans and time. So Angela Davis is always going to give you the history, going to give you the philosophy, right? Lennox S. Hines was one of Asada's lawyers in her multiple court cases, which they provide like a timeline of the many times that she was persecuted and attempted to be prosecuted by the federal government. And so lawyer Lennox says, quote, writing simply and vividly about the racism that permeated her childhood and young womanhood, those ordinary experiences of Black people in the United States that have driven millions to despair and many to rebellion. Asada leads us all to understand more about the society we live in. He also says, in the history of New Jersey, no woman, pretrial detainee, or prisoner has ever been treated as she was, continuously confined in a men's prison, under 24-hour surveillance of her most intimate functions, without intellectual sustenance, adequate medical attention, and exercise, and without the company of other women for all those years she was in their custody. He continues, dear sister, thank you for sending us your vital voice and sharing your passion and commitment with us. Meanwhile, we in this society must remind ourselves again how we threaten our own interests and rights when we condone by our silence the government's use of surveillance, attacks on the legitimacy of political activists, and the use of criminal law to suppress and to punish political dissent. When I was first coming to it and saying, I'm going to search for the revolutionary, I think this time I was looking for Asada, the person. I was also looking for the ways in which her visibility and her vulnerability went hand in hand, but also enabled us to know her and to know what revolution entails, what it needs. We would not know Asada or her life story if she had not decided to be visibly and vulnerably defiant. So, like I said before, I'm not going to be able to go through the whole book. I literally have sticky notes on like every other page, but I am going to point out certain passages that are in alignment with our theme today and just others that I thought were cool. First place that we meet Asada in her autobiography is when she brings us right to that moment of arrest. We enter into the world of Asada in this world that she's in through the moment that the state disables her. And so the first place that I want to bring our attention to is to think about how even in this vulnerable space, in this space where she was in fact wounded and not just able to be wounded, but wounded, she began to think about the power of spirituality. She had family, well, she didn't have many visitors because of the racist and sexist oppression that she experienced and suppression that she experienced, but she was able to get some books from the nurses, and sometimes people would bring her things while she was in the hospital. And she talks about the books being an opening into a spiritual moment for her. And so I'll quote her here. When I read the book about Black women, I felt the spirits of those sisters feeding me, making me stronger. Black women have been struggling and helping each other to survive the blows of life since the beginning of time. When I read Siddhartha, a peace came over me. I felt a unity with all things living. The world, in spite of oppression, is a beautiful place. I would say, Om, softly to myself, letting my lips vibrate. I felt the birds, the sun, and the trees. I was in communion with all the forces on the earth that truly love people, in communion with all the revolutionary forces on the earth. And this communion is what allowed her to survive, right? It's what allowed her to survive that instance of violence, the being disabled by the state. And in the paragraph that follows, she says, "There was a bullet in my chest. It's still there." And, if you sit there and you think like, damn, did Asada Shakur die with a bullet from the state in her chest? And then you think, how many of us are carrying the state in our chest, our hearts, our minds, and are being killed by the state through structural abandonment, through all the things that the state has brought on us? But she was happy to be alive. There was a bullet in my chest. It's still there. An injured lung with fluid in it, a broken clavicle, and a paralyzed arm with undetermined damage to my nerves. I kept asking if I would be able to use my hand again. One or two doctors said flatly, no. The other said, maybe yes, maybe no. And anyway, I was gonna live. And then she ends with the poem, story. You died. I cried and kept on getting up, a little slower and a lot more deadly. She then moves us from this chapter to her origins. We learn that she was born July 16th, maybe. She's definitely a Cancer queen. That is definitely felt in her convictions and the way that she builds relationships and in home in the work. But what I found to be really interesting in these descriptions of herself, right, is that we begin to see the seeds of her as a revolutionary. She has early speech development. She has some sensitivity stuff, some sensory stuff, right? She talks about screaming at the top of her lungs whenever anybody wearing furs or feathers came near her as a baby. And so even as an adult, still not liking those textures. And I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, go ahead, neuro expansive queen. And I think multiple things about that, but one thing in particular is like you kind of have to be neuroexpansive, neurodivergent, just not normative neurologically, right, to be able to imagine and to act on freedom, right? Neurotypical people are okay with the status quo because the status quo is suited to them. She moved to Wilmington, North Carolina to live with her grandfather and her grandmother when she was young because her mother had things to do, had to get her life together, which is a very common thing for Black mothers at that time. But it is there with her Southern Black family that she starts to practice of ruthless self-devotion. And she starts to really build up that sense of personal dignity, that sense of self-worth that is absolutely necessary to fight for liberation by any means necessary. And so she says, quote, all of my family tried to instill in me a sense of personal dignity, but my grandmother and my grandfather were really fanatic about it. Over and over, they would tell me, you're as good as anyone else. Don't let anybody tell you that they're better than you. My grandparents strictly forbade me to say, yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, or to look down at my shoes or make subservient gestures when talking to white people. You look them in the eye when you talk to them, I was told, and speak up like you got some sense. I was told to speak in a loud, clear voice and to hold my head up high or risk having my grandparents knock it off my shoulders. My grandparents were big on respect. I was to be polite and respectful to adults, to say good morning or good evening as I passed the neighbors' houses. Any kind of back talk or sass was simply out of the question. My grandparents didn't even permit me to answer questions with a simple yes or no. Instead, I had to say yes, grandmother, or no, grandfather. But when it came to dealing with white people in the segregated South, my grandmother would tell me menacingly, don't you respect nobody that don't respect you. You hear me? Yes, grandmother. I would answer, my voice almost a whisper. Speak up, she would tell me repeatedly, something she seemed hell-bent on making me do. Her grandmother would make her do these kind of, I call them in my notes here, I call them small acts of self respect, like making her demand self respect from people, going to the store and ensuring that they give you exactly what you want. Like, I'm sure if Asada was getting her hair done and the hairdresser was not bumping the ends the right way, grandma would be like, gotta speak up. But she also would use real life as examples for Asada. Asada says, whenever my grandmother heard about somebody being mistreated, especially if it was a man mistreating a woman, she would glare at me and say, don't you let nobody mistreat you, you hear? We're not raising you up to be mistreated, you hear? I don't want you taking no mess off of nobody, you understand? Yes, grandmother, I would answer, for what seemed like the millionth time, wondering why my grandmother liked to repeat herself so often. The tactics that my grandparents used were crude, and I hated it when they would repeat everything so often. But the lessons that they taught me, more than anything else I learned in life, helped me to deal with the things I would face growing up in America. Her grandmother had her engaging in these constant small acts of demanding respect. And that's what helped make Asada an uncompromising freedom fighter. Because let's be real about it, right? How can you fight for liberation if you can't even fight for yourself and your own respect? And it makes me think about, I wrote here in my sticky note, Glorilla in her song I Ain't Going, where she says, I'm going to die by my respect. As Asada continues to encounter different young men, Nazis, police, etc., who disrespect her, she constantly engages in these struggles for self respect and self determination. And that is something that I found to be very moving, is even if it would have cost her her life, she spoke. She refused to be silent. She refused to be disrespected. Something else that I found to be really interesting was that Asada was always figuring out ways to break the rules. And this is something I resonated with because I don't know if this is surprising, but like I used to be a sneaky child. Like I would try to figure out how to do things that my friends at school were doing and still, go to cult church and be okay. And maybe that's why Sky Daddy didn't fuck with me like that. But like I used to skip school and all those things like Asada did. And I was reading this and I was like, oh, like, is that why I'm an anarchist? Like I just don't be trying to follow rules. But she was always trying to break the rules, even the ones that her grandmother would give her in regards to whom to play with, how to dress, just all these other things. And we see in this chapter in particular that she becomes conscious of class very early on, but she didn't really realize how much it impacted her life until she became a revolutionary in her adulthood. Like most Black people, right? She started out trying to be as respectable as possible, but always felt connected to Blackness. And she says, quote, I was supposed to be a child version of a goodwill ambassador, out to prove that Black people were not stupid or dirty or smelly or uncultured. I carried out this mission as best I could to show that I was good, to show that I was as good as they were. I never questioned the things they thought were good. I saved my culture, my music, my dancing, the richness of Black speech for the times when I was with my own people. And in many ways, I was living a double existence. And so she's talking about pretending to be interested in the things or having to live in that kind of double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois named that he hated because he wanted to be white for a good bit of his life. But that kind of double consciousness that you have to do as a Black person, particularly as she was growing up in the South, going to schools with people, she had to figure out how to hide away herself when she would be in schools with white people. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was that Asada talks about loving the beach. And she says, for me, the beach was a wonderful place. And to this day, there is no place on earth that I love more. Like, she's a true Cancer for real. She loved the ocean, she loved the water. And it's clear from how she described her interest in her life, right, that she was not a neurotypical person. In her childhood, she loved to play games like hopscotch, marbles, and cowboys and Indians. But she says something really interesting about that. She says, quote, I always wanted to be an Indian and would hide over or under something and leap out shrieking at the top of my lungs. I guess I was unusual in that respect because most of the kids wanted to be cowboys. So, also, her spiritual origins and beginnings. Asada became Catholic actually as a young child. And she said she did it because it was, quote, spooky, which I thought was so funny. I guess Catholicism could be thought of as spooky. And so she said it must be the real God because it's spooky. And there's something really astute that she notes, though, is that Catholics had two kinds of sin. And she says, quote, now a venial sin is a sin that's not so bad. It's a white sin. But a mortal sin is terrible. It is a Black sin. And in that, right, she nods to what we have talked about in the podcast in our learning community, right, which is the ways in which whiteness is mapped onto life with a capital L, this form of ascension under capitalism that's deeply connected to a Christian understanding of the world, right? Blackness being akin to death, being the mortal, quote unquote, sin that is something that you can't move past. I think if there is anything that is important to read from her work, it is her statement to my people. And so, because I could not find the audio recording of her reading it, I am going to read it. So Asada writes this statement while she is falsely imprisoned and she is getting ready to go to trial for something that she did not do. They have her in solitary confinement away from other folks. So she's learning about the demonization that's happening of her in the public eye through the media from her lawyer, who is her aunt, Evelyn. So she's receiving a lot of hate mail. She's receiving a lot of correspondence from people based on the narratives that they're telling about the media. So she was paranoid. She says here, like, she was very paranoid about the letters. She wrote a lot while she was in the county workhouse, the Middlesex County workhouse. And she wanted to get the word out. This refusal to be silent, this refusal to kind of sit in that place of silence and her vulnerability. She wanted to get the word out to folks about who she is and what she was about, right? To resist some of the demonization that was happening to her. And she says, I had to talk to my people and let them know what I was about, where I was really coming from. The statement seemed to take forever to write. I wanted to make a tape of it and enlisted Evelyn's help. As my lawyer, she was dead set against it and advised me not to make the tape. But as a Black woman living in America, Evelyn understood why it was important and necessary. So, in my notes here, I have a tape out to the people, Asada the podcaster. But she made the tape entitled To My People on July 4th, 1973. And it was broadcast on many radio stations. And here it is. Black brothers, Black sisters, I want you to know that I love you. And I hope that somewhere in your hearts, you have love for me. My name is Asada Shakur, slave name Joanne Cherismard. And I am a revolutionary, a Black revolutionary. By that, I mean that I have declared war on all the forces that have raped our women, castrated our men, and kept our babies empty-bellied. I have declared war on the rich who prosper on our poverty, the politicians who lie to us with smiling faces, and all the mindless, heartless robots who protect them and their property. I am a Black revolutionary, and as such, I am a victim of all of the wrath, hatred, and slander that America is capable of. Like all other Black revolutionaries, America is trying to lynch me. I am a Black revolutionary woman, and because of this, I have been charged with and accused of every alleged crime in which a woman was believed to have participated. The alleged crimes in which only men were supposedly involved, I have been accused of planning. They have plastered pictures alleged to be me in post offices, airports, hotels, police cars, subways, banks, television, and newspapers. They have offered over $50,000 in rewards for my capture, and they have issued orders to shoot on sight and shoot to kill. I am a Black revolutionary, and by definition, that makes me a part of the Black Liberation Army. The pigs have used their newspapers and TVs to paint the Black Liberation Army as vicious, brutal, mad dog criminals. They have called us gangsters and gun moles and have compared us to such characters as John Dillinger and Ma Barker. It should be clear to anyone who can think, see, or hear that we are the victims and not the criminals. It should also be clear to us by now who the real criminals are. Nixon and his crime partners have murdered hundreds of third world brothers and sisters in Vietnam, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa. As was proved by Watergate, the top law enforcement officials in this country are a lying bunch of criminals. The president, 2 attorney generals, the head of the FBI, the head of the CIA, and half the White House staff have been implicated in the Watergate crimes. They call us murderers, but we do not They call us murderers, but we did not murder over 250 unarmed Black men, women, and children, or wound thousands of others in the riots they provoked during the 60s. The rulers of this country have always considered their property more important than our lives. They call us murderers, but we were not responsible for the 28 brother inmates and 9 hostages murdered at Attica. They call us murderers, but we did not murder and wound over 30 unarmed Black students at Jackson State or Southern State either. They call us murderers, but we did not murder Martin Luther King Jr., Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, George Jackson, Nat Turner, James Chaney, and countless others. We did not murder by shooting in the back, 16-year-old Rita Lloyd, 11-year-old Ricky Boughton, or 10-year-old Clifford Glover. They call us murderers, but we do not control or enforce a system of racism and oppression that systematically murders Black and Third World people. Although Black people supposedly comprise about 15% of the total American population, at least 60% of murder victims are Black. For every pig that is killed in the so-called line of duty, there are at least 50 Black people murdered by the police. Black life expectancy is much lower than white, and they do their best to kill us before we are even born. We are burned alive in fire-trapped tenements. Our brothers and sisters OD daily from heroin and methadone. Our babies die from lead poisoning. Millions of Black people have died as a result of indecent medical care. This is murder. But they have got the gall to call us murderers. They call us kidnappers. Yet Brother Clark Squire, who is accused along with me of murdering a New Jersey state trooper, was kidnapped on April 2nd, 1969, from our Black community and held on $1 million ransom in the New York Panther 21 conspiracy case. He was acquitted on May 13th, 1971, along with all the others, of 156 counts of conspiracy by a jury who took less than 2 hours to deliberate. Brother Squire was innocent, yet he was kidnapped from his community and family. Over 2 years of his life was stolen, but they call us kidnappers. We did not kidnap the thousands of brothers and sisters held captive in America's concentration camps. 90% of the prison population in this country are Black and Third World people who can afford neither bail nor lawyers. They call us thieves and bandits. They say we steal, but it was not we who stole millions of Black people from the continent of Africa. We were robbed of our language, of our gods, of our culture, of our human dignity, of our labor, and of our lives. They call us thieves. Yet it is not we who ripped off billions of dollars every year through tax evasions, illegal price fixing, embezzlement, consumer fraud, bribes, kickbacks, and swindles. They call us bandits. Yet every time most Black people pick up our paychecks, we are being robbed. Every time we walk into a store in our neighborhood, we are being held up. And every time we pay our rent, the landlord sticks a gun into our ribs. They call us thieves, but we did not rob and murder millions of Indians by ripping off their homeland, then call ourselves pioneers. They call us bandits, but it is not we who are robbing Africa, Asia, and Latin America of their natural resources and freedom, while the people who live there are sick and starving. The rulers of this country and their flunkies have committed some of the most brutal, vicious crimes in history. They are the bandits. They are the murderers, and they should be treated as such. These maniacs are not fit to judge me, Clark, or any other Black person on trial in America. Black people should, and inevitably, must determine our destinies. Every revolution in history has been accomplished by actions, although words are necessary. We must create shields that protect us and spears that penetrate our enemies. Black people must learn how to struggle by struggling. We must learn by our mistakes. I want to apologize to you, my Black brothers and sisters, for being on the New Jersey Turnpike. I should have known better. The Turnpike is a checkpoint where Black people are stopped, searched, harassed, and assaulted. Revolutionaries must never be in too much of a hurry or make careless decisions. He who runs when the sun is sleeping will stumble many times. Every time a Black freedom fighter is murdered or captured, the pigs try to create the impression that they have quashed the movement, destroyed our forces, and put down the Black revolution. The pigs also try to give the impression that 5 or 10 guerrillas are responsible for every revolutionary action carried out in America. That is nonsense. That is absurd. Black revolutionaries do not drop from the moon. We are created by our conditions, shaped by our oppression. We are being manufactured in droves in the ghetto streets. Places like Attica, San Quentin, Bedford Hills, Leavenworth, and Sing Sing. They are turning out thousands of us. Many jobless Black veterans and welfare mothers are joining our ranks. Brothers and sisters from all walks of life who are tired of suffering passively make up the BLA. There is, and always will be, until every Black man, woman, and child is free, a Black Liberation Army. The main function of the Black Liberation Army at this time is to create good examples, to struggle for Black freedom, and to prepare for the future. We must defend ourselves and let no one disrespect us. We must gain our liberation by any means necessary. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. In the spirit of Ronald Carter, William Christmas, Mark Clark, Mark Essex, Frank Heavy Fields, Woody Changa Olumbala Green, Fred Hampton, Lil Bobby Hutton, George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, James McLean, Harold Russell, Zaid Malik Shakur, Anthony Kumu Olumbala White. We must fight on. There are so many things that I could say about this tape, Asada's podcast. But the one thing that I think I'll note before I move on and let you think for yourself about your own meanings for it is that Asada does an excellent job of describing capitalism without using the word capitalism. She does an excellent job of asserting her own, I don't want to use the word innocence because it doesn't really mean anything, right? But asserting her own position, her own space-time place in the world, her structural position as a Black woman, a Black revolutionary, while teaching others about what that means. She conjures in this speech, she conjures other Black liberation fighters. She says, look at the ghetto, look at the prison, look at the scorned Black veteran, look at the scorned Black mother. You too are a revolutionary. For those who are sick and tired of being sick and tired of America's bullshit, you too will fight back. And we see her in this, right, also point to her grandmother's words about disrespect as well. The most quoted part of her tape were those last 4 lines that I read. Folks hold on to that. They chant that. It is a duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And that chant is something that I've heard in many, 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 many marches and songs even. But to hear that it comes, or to read and to hear and to know that it comes at the end of this tape, it really has a different meaning, or a much more striking meaning, at least for me. So in addition to, or I guess as part of her revolutionary practice, Asada writes poetry. There were a few of them that were particularly exciting for me. So I am going to just read the poem she wrote in honor of a friend that she made while she was imprisoned. Her friend named Eva, a rhinoceros woman who nobody wants and everybody used. They say you're crazy because you're not crazy enough to kneel when told to kneel. Hey, big woman, with scars on the head and scars on the heart that never seemed to heal. I saw your light and it was shining. You gave them love. They gave you shit. You gave them you. They gave you Hollywood. They purr at you because you know how to roar and back it up with realness. Rhinoceros woman, big mama in a little world. You closed your eyes and neon spun inside your head because it was dark outside. You read your Bible, but God never came. Your daddy would have loved you, but what would the neighbors say? They hate you, mama, because you expose their madness and their cruelty. They can see in your eyes 1,000 nightmares that they have made come true. Black woman, bad woman. Wear your bigness on your chest like a badge because you done earned it. Strong woman, Amazon. Wear your scars like jewelry because they were bought with blood. They call you mad and almost had you believe in that shit. They called you ugly and you hid yourself behind yourself and wallowed in their shame. Rhinoceros woman. The world is blind and slight of mind and cannot see how beautiful you are. I saw your light and it was shining. I think I'm just in awe of her genius. I am. So we learn more about her experience in prison. And she concludes the chapter with something that I think is just extremely important for us to understand and hold on to, which is on page 70, she says, quote, I knew it in theory, but I had not seen enough to accept the fact that there was absolutely no justice whatsoever for Black people in America. I still had some hope left, but they had taken something that was supposed to help us and turned it against us. They had used the law to abuse the law. Now all we have to do, I reasoned, is to get the facts and figures and prove that they are trying to deny us a fair trial. How little did I know? And so she then takes us back to her junior high days. And she is vulnerable with us about her journey in living in a colorist world with a colorist lens and with an anti-Black lens. And she talks about the relationship that it cost her. Well, probably one of many relationships that it cost her in junior high. And she learns from that experience to never demean Blackness again. She essentially rebuffs a boy who liked her, who was sweet. Everybody else said that he was too dark. And so she too rebuffs him, tells him that he's too Black. She says, I didn't know what to say. My tongue became heavy and twisted. I started to stutter. Nothing came out of my mouth. Why not? He asked again. I stammered and stuttered, and then with icy bluntness, I said, because you're too Black and ugly. I will never forget the look on his face. He looked at me with such cold hatred that I was stunned. I was instantly sorry for what I had said, but there was no taking it back. He looked at me as if he despised me more than anyone else on the face of the earth. I felt so ugly and dirty and depraved. I was shaken to the bone for weeks, maybe months afterward. I was haunted by what happened that day, by the snakes that had crawled out of my mouth. The sneering hatred on his face every time I saw him after that made me know there was nothing I could do to make it up to him. There was nothing I could do but change myself, not for him, but for me. And I did change. After that, I never said Black and ugly in the same sentence and never thought it. Of course, I couldn't undo all the years of self-hatred and brainwashing in that short time, but it was a beginning. And although I still cared too much about what people thought about me, I always tried hard after that to stand on my own 2 feet, to stand by what I felt and thought and not just be a robot. I didn't always succeed, but I always tried like hell. And one of the things that I thought was really generative from her sharing this experience, because she could have not, right? But I think what is important for us to glean from this vulnerability that she shares with us is the way that she talks about how she was determined to change and how for so many of us who grew up in a colorist society, we've been taught, conditioned to associate blackness with ugliness, to associate blackness with death, to associate blackness with all these things. The lesson for her was not to double down, not to be so offended and so fragile in response to his expression of hurt and pain, but to think about the ways in which she could show up differently so that she would never harm someone in community like that again. That is accountability. It's accountability, and it's not one that is structured through a kind of typical transformative justice framework, right, in which both parties are involved and the harmed party determines what accountability looks like, et cetera, et cetera. It's her own sense of direction informed by her vulnerability to be accountable, not just to him, but to other Black people moving forward. That is not how the liberals be moving at all. Another thing that was interesting to me as a researcher who researches sexual violence is how sexual violence is something that is present in the book in a lot of different ways. We see the sexual violence in the prison through the searches, though Asada doesn't really talk a lot about the interactions that happen between guards and women and men and others in the prison. We understand that sexual violence is present in the prison from what we know about prisons and what happens there. But she also talks about those formative sexually violent experiences that she has um as she grows up from a Black girl into a young Black woman. But in each of these experiences, which I found to be so, and I hate to say the word fascinating, but something that really for me as a researcher, me as a survivor, was just so informative and so just like, is that because someone taught her when she was a young child not to let anybody disrespect her by any means necessary. When she was faced with disrespect, whether that disrespect came from a white man or white boy or a Black man and a Black boy, she didn't stand for it. And she defended herself by any means necessary. Whenever she was in a situation in which someone could have caused her sexual harm, she fought back. And I'm not saying that as like, that was the proper response or the best response. And for folks who, like myself, didn't fight back, right? We have different responses of freeze and of fawn, etc. Just made me think like, fuck, like nobody in my life growing up taught me that I was worthy of respect. And so perhaps that response that feels instinctual, the freeze or fawn response, actually is not, but actually it was one I was conditioned into through being around adults my entire life and upbringing who didn't teach me that I was worthy of respect and that I shouldn't let others disrespect me because they were disrespecting me. And so she has many moments where she experiences gendered and sexual violence. She fights back to end that disrespect. On page 75, she talks about getting to a fight with this boy named David who was attempting to sexually assault her. Then later on, she talks about getting her first job working at a factory cafeteria where she's sexually harassed by her boss there. Asada also, because she is a political educator, discusses the history of Black women and interracial sexual violence as the backdrop or the primary form of violence that animates Black women's structural position in the United States. And she says, any Black woman practically anywhere in America can tell you about being approached, propositioned, and harassed by white men. Many consider all Black women potential prostitutes. In the village, this phenomenon was 10 times worse than elsewhere. It was almost impossible to go from one corner to the next without some white man hissing at you, following you, or jingling the money in his pockets. She encounters a couple of white boys who essentially put her in sex work. And so Osada meets these two white boys. They're like, yeah, you can trick white men into giving you money and just running away. And this Black woman comes and saves her and says, girl, don't you got any sense? Like, you could die and nobody would know to look for you. And like, this is the era where people don't have internet. Like if you went missing, you went missing. People don't have cell phones. They don't got to find my iPhone. Like she could have been killed. And we learn as the text progresses that the woman who saves her, who recognizes her as a runaway at the age of 13 and shelters her, is trans on page 106. So I found that to be so fascinating. Asada doesn't make a big deal out of it. You learn in like a few lines that the woman, Miss Shirley, she's beautiful. She's dressed really nicely, right? But she is the one who ends up saving Asada's life and keeping her off the streets. Here, we can clearly bookmark that trans women be saving people. And that trans woman recognized Asada was a child, recognized that she felt unsafe at home, probably had similar experiences in her own becoming, and provided a place of shelter and safety for this child that she didn't know. The ways in which queer and trans people constitute the background, the container, a Black community, we see here and we see everywhere. It is by no accident, right, that they are targeted, by no accident. And so it's important for us to think about this, right, as we're thinking about vulnerability and visibility, as we're thinking about unlearning our silence, refusing silence. For those of us who are not trans or who do not identify as trans or do not have a trans experience, what are the ways in which we can recognize how Black trans people in our communities are constituting community, one, but like building the container for a community and actually allowing community to exist and survive? And what are we doing to ensure that they are safe and that they are taken care of? And I think too, right, if we think about this in the context of a trans woman saving her from potentially more sexual violence, more bodily harm, the harm that, we don't know what Miss Shirley has experienced, but probably has experienced living in New York at that time and coming into her own selfhood. Asada not only talks about the dangers of interracial sexual violence, she also describes moments where she experienced intraracial sexual violence. There were multiple attempts of a rape by Black boys. And I can imagine in these moments that the words of her grandmother kept coming back to her, to never let anyone disrespect her. And in one of those incidences, Asada describes how she fought back when a group of boys attempted to gang rape her. She is alert. At first, the panic sets in, and then she realizes that the boys whose mother's apartment that they're in, he says, don't mess up the stuff in my mom's house. Like, she's going to be so mad at me. So she's like, oh, gotcha, Black ass. And starts destroying his shit. She gets him in trouble and I'm laughing, but it's just like she gets him in trouble. She's like, no, like, you want to hurt me or harm me. Why should I allow you to be unscathed? Why should I allow you to leave this interaction, this experience, this violence unscathed? Like, why? And it made me really think about the times in my own life when I was explicitly told as a child to prioritize the experience and the life and the future of the person who was violating me over my own. Like the literal exact opposite. Like, make yourself smaller so that you don't disrupt this person's life. And I know that for so many of us, especially if you connect with me in my work, you probably have had those experiences. And it is my prayer, my heartfelt prayer, that you don't anymore. That you recognize that you can expand and grow and defend yourself, protect yourself, and live your life by any means necessary. I was in Senegal presenting on my work around self power. And I can link the video of the presentation and the talk for folks in the show notes if you're interested. And you can read all the comments. Presumably, Black men and women thought about my work and the things I was saying. But I had this really interesting, and by interesting, that's the least descriptive word. One of the scholars present asked me a common question that folks have. So she worked in a European country where there were a lot of refugees from a place in Africa. And she worked with another young woman who was a volunteer who would help these immigrants acclimate to this European country. And even in this position of service, which that being one of the conditions that opened her to violence and exploitation, but in this position of relative power with young men from those countries, she would still experience sexual violence, attempts to violate her in her space. And from the sense of the question, it seemed that some of the attempts were not just attempts, but were successful. And the young woman carried so much guilt and shame around her experiences because she didn't want to report these men who were on government assistance, who were refugees, because they would be deported. And mom was like, yeah, so like, what do you do? Because obviously, you know, them being deported, they would go back to their home countries and who knows what would happen to them. And I said, well, why isn't that the thing that they're thinking about before they violate her? Like, oh shit, like if I do this, I could go back to a place where I would be hurt and harmed. Why is she more worried about the consequences than they are? Why did she take the responsibility of the state onto herself? And I think for so many of us who are in movement spaces or in those kind of spaces where we find disrespect to be part and parcel of our experience in those spaces, it's important for us to dislodge that, right? To say, okay, wait, am I submitting to my own oppression to help someone else who can't be bothered not to violate me in order to stay alive? Why do they see my suffering as the terms for their living? And why do I see that as well? If no one else has told you, I'll be the first to say your suffering is not the terms for your liberation or collective liberation. And there is a marked difference between struggle and suffering. And so many of our movements have made the words synonymous, have made the sacrificing of our body, spirit, minds the terms of our quote unquote liberation. But why is that liberation if it matches the experiences of our oppression? How could it possibly be liberation if it matches the terms and the experiences of our oppression? Okay, so Miss Shirley saves Asada, gets her up off the streets, gets her out of, keeps her from being pimped by those white boys, and gets her a job. But the job is sex work, but it's not, you know, involving the body in the ways that certain kinds of sex work would. Working as a barmaid, she's using her beauty and attractiveness to lure men into buying more drinks at the bar. That's her job. And she was doing that for God knows how long. She doesn't really get no timeline in true cancer fashion. Time is manipulated, but but she was getting by. And this was until her aunt's friend peeped her and said, "Girl, if you don't bring your black ass home, your mama is looking for you. Your aunt is looking for you." And that moment just really made me smile and chuckle to myself because I said, wow, Black folks will have community and we'll take care of each other. And I think that that was such a beautiful illustration of that. One other thing that she talks about intraracial sexual violence, she also makes a structural argument about it too. And there were a couple moments in the text where I was like, Asada is kind of giving low key, is kind of giving Afro pessimist low key. And this was one of them. She says, the more I watched how boys and girls behaved, the more I read and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this behavior could be traced directly back to the plantation when slaves were encouraged to take the misery of their lives out on each other instead of the master. The slave masters taught us we were ugly, less than human, unintelligent, and many of us believed it. Black people became breeding animals, studs, and mares. A Black woman was fair game for anyone at any time, the master or a visiting guest or any redneck who desired her. The slave master would order her to have 6 with this stud, 7 with that stud, for the purpose of increasing his stock. She was considered less than a woman. She was a cross between a whore and a workhorse. Black men internalized the white man's opinion of Black women. And if you ask me, a lot of us still act like we're back on the plantation with Massa pulling the strings. I don't know, honey. That's a read. That's a real read right there. Okay, I just had to sit up a little bit more in this chair. Oh, because my back. So, in the next chapter, we're back. We're back in jail, unfortunately, with Asada, and she takes up crocheting, which I think a lot of folks had their crocheting phase. And I just really love how relatable she is, even though this is her 50 plus years ago, it still hits. But what's interesting is here where she talks about the conception of her daughter. And I cite this as another instance of ruthless self devotion because she chooses to have a child with her comrade, Kamal. And she says, well, they better not try to come around me asking no questions. I told them. I'll tell them that this baby was sent by the Black creator to liberate Black people. I'll tell them that this baby is a new Black Messiah, conceived in a holy way, come to lead our people to freedom and justice and to create a new Black nation. She continues, I wanted with all my being for my baby to experience the many types and sides of love and friendship, and to know and understand selflessness and generosity, struggle and sacrifice, honesty, courage, and so many of the sentiments that have given me strength and have made my life worth living. There were so many struggles that she had with having a child. She had to fight for her right to have a healthy pregnancy. The doctors at the prison would have let her miscarry. They were determined to, actually. And it was a Black doctor who helped save her and her baby's life when she was at a point where things were dangerous for her. And I thought about it. I was like, people had so much courage back then because now it's like, would a nigga even do this? I don't know. But all of her fighting it was worth it. Her daughter came into the world. And I just, my heart, like, in reading this, I was just like, wow, like, to be in prison with like a bullet in your chest, you're still learning how to recover from that. You're in solitary confinement. You are constantly being abused. You're constantly having to fight for your respect, for the basic things that you need, for edible food, all these things. And to still see the beauty in the future, so much so that you would give birth. That really speaks to her belief in revolution and in a world that is different from the one in which she lived and grew up in. That is beautiful. And it does speak to a kind of ruthless self devotion. For the folks who do reproductive justice work, I think this experience that she details would be interesting to think about. We think about the experience of Black women in prisons and their ability to give birth in a healthy and safe way, right, which is impossible in prison. And it really speaks to the ways that the reproductive justice movement has to be connected to the abolitionist movement. There is no reproductive justice if prisons exist. Because as long as prisons exist, there'll be Black mothers and other Black people who give birth in them, and other Black people who would want to, seed birth as well. So I would say the second half of the book is really where the timelines start to converge. We get to see more of Asada's becoming as the political educator, as a Black Panther, as a revolutionary. And she is hilarious. I think her sense of humor is so funny. But one of the things that she does so well is describe white people and describe liberals. And she does an excellent job of doing that. And again, pointing out things that I find to be hilarious or interesting in her work. This definition of liberal sent me, and I will read it. So she's describing this is essentially when she came home, didn't get along with her mama too well, so she lives with her aunt. They live on 80th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus in Manhattan. And so she's talking about the Upper West Side. And she says, the Upper West Side, as the neighborhood was called, was supposed to be a liberal stronghold. I have never really understood exactly what a liberal is, since I have heard liberals express every conceivable opinion on every conceivable subject. As far as I can tell, you have the extreme right, who are fascist, racist, capitalist dogs like Ronald Reagan, who come right out and let you know where they're coming from. And on the opposite end, you have the left, who are supposed to be committed to justice, equality, and human rights. And somewhere between the 2 points is the liberal. As far as I'm concerned, liberal is the most meaningless word in the dictionary. History has shown me that as long as some white middle class people can live high on the hog, take vacations to Europe, send their children to private schools, and reap the benefits of their white skin privileges, then they are liberals. But when times get hard and money gets tight, they pull off that liberal mask and you think you're talking to Adolf Hitler. They feel sorry for the so called underprivileged just as long as they can maintain their own privileges. I mean, for this to be written 40 something years ago, we could copy and paste this as a definition of liberals today. One other kind of interesting personality thing that I was reading for Asada the person was that she was also someone who embraced change, which for me, like the cancers I know, unless they have like a fire placement, they do not be trying to change. But I think that also was an essential part of her personality for being a revolutionary. And I'm sure there are lots of folks who've talked about this, but I think there is a certain kind of embracing of change, of difference of instability, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. In transformation, that is essential to be a revolutionary. And she talks about that. She says that when she entered into a different school, it was a change. And I have always been a person who likes a change of scenery. She's not afraid to face the unknown. And I wonder how and why. I truly do. One of the connections I made from that was Parable of the Sower when Octavia Butler writes the character Lauren Olamina. And Lauren Olamina starts the book by talking about how God is change. And Lauren Olamina goes on to lead Earthseed. To be a revolutionary, you have to be comfortable with change because you want to change the status quo. You can't be afraid of things changing. So Asada, like many of us, tried to give the NAACP our time, and like many of us were sorely disappointed. She talks about being fired up. She's got this believe in change, and I want to act that change out and change the world. And so she joins the NAACP because she's like, these are the people who are fighting back, because we've all done that. We've all picked the conservative centrist organization first and then realize our mistakes. And so the with the NAACP though, she remembers participating in their trainings and their intense focus on nonviolence. So she says on page 138, and so when I saw these NAACP people, I was ready to do whatever it was that they were going to do, but they were very confusing. One day I was hanging around in the office and two men were talking about nonviolence and self control. Then he walked around the room asking everybody questions. What would you do if they pushed you? Nothing. I'd just keep on doing what I came to do. What would you do if they kicked you? I'd pray to the Lord to forgive them for their sins. What would you do if they spit on you? I'd just go on singing. Well, that was just too much for me, she says. I could take someone pushing me, hitting me, kicking me, but to sit there and let some cracker dog spit on me? Well, just the idea of it made me want to fight. To me, if someone spit on you, it was worse than hitting you, especially if they spit in your face. I tried to tell myself that I would just sit there and take it, but every muscle in my body, every instinct I had, rebelled against it. The man continued around the room asking everybody the same questions. When he got to me, I answered the same too, except for the spitting question. I don't know, I told him. What do you mean? You don't know? I just don't know. Well, little sister, we can see that you're just not ready. If you want your freedom, there's no sacrifice that's too big to make. And so then she talks about inclusion. She talks about the false belief in reforming the government and how people falsely believe that appealing to the morality of their oppressors will allow them to win. And she finishes this reflection with talking about the importance of self-protection. When I think back to those days, I feel such admiration and respect for the spirit of struggle and sacrifice that my people exhibited. They went up against white mobs, hoses, vicious dogs, the Ku Klux Klan, trigger happy nightstick wielding police, armed only with their belief in justice and their desire for freedom. I remember how I felt in those days. I wanted to be an American just like any other American. I wanted a piece of America's apple pie. I believe we could get our freedom just by appealing to the consciences of white people. I believe that the North was really interested in integration and civil rights and equal rights. I used to go around saying our country, our president, our government. When the national anthem was played or the Pledge of Allegiance spoken, I stood at attention and felt proud. I don't know what in the hell I was feeling proud about, but I felt the juice of patriotism running through my blood. I believe that if the South could only be like the North, then everything would be all right. I believe that we Black people were really making progress and that the government, the president, the Supreme Court, and the Congress were behind us. So we couldn't go wrong. I believe that integration was really the solution to our problems. I believe that if white people could go to school with us, live next to us, work next to us, they would see that we were really good people and would stop being prejudiced against us. I believe that America was really a good country. Like my teacher said in school, the greatest country on the face of the earth. I grew up believing that stuff, really believing it. And now, 20 odd years later, it seems like a bad joke. Nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who were oppressing them. Once you study and really get a good understanding of the way the system in the United States works, then you see, without a doubt, that the civil rights movement never had a chance of succeeding. She talks a bit about white people benefiting from Black oppression. She says, the rich have always used racism to maintain power, to hate someone, to discriminate against them, and to attack them because of their racial characteristics is one of the most primitive, reactionary, ignorant ways of thinking that exists. A war between the races would help nobody and free nobody and should be avoided at all costs. But a one-sided race war with Black people as the targets and white people shooting the guns is worse. We will be criminally negligent, however, if we do not deal with racism and racist violence, and if we do not prepare to defend ourselves against it. We come back to Asada in the next chapter. She gives birth and experiences some really horrible violence. She writes a poem after being separated from her daughter because is still incarcerated. And I believe at this time she's incarcerated at Rikers. And this poem is one of my favorites. Leftovers. What is left? After the bars and the gates and the degradation, what is left? After the lock-ins and the lockouts and the lockups, what is left? I mean, after the chains that get entangled in the gray of one's matter, after the bars that get stuck in the hearts of men and women, what is left? After the tears and disappointments, after the lonely isolation, after the cut wrist and the heavy noose, what is left? I mean, like, after the commissary kisses and the get your shit off blues, after the hustler has been hustled, what is left? After the murder burgers and the goon squads and the tear gas, after the bulls and the bullpens and the bullshit, what is left? Like after you know that God can't be trusted, after you know that the shrink is a pusher, that the word is a whip and the badge is a bullet, what is left? After you know that the dead are still walking, after you realize that silence is talking, that outside and inside are just an illusion, what is left? I mean, like, where is the sun? Where are her arms and where are her kisses? There are lip prints on my pillow. I am searching. What is left? I mean, like, nothing is standstill and nothing is abstract. The wing of a butterfly can't take flight. The foot on my neck is part of a body. The song that I sing is part of an echo. What is left? I mean, like, love is specific. Is my mind a machine gun? Is my heart a hacksaw? Can I make freedom real? Yeah. What is left? I am at the top and bottom of a lowerarchy. I am an earth lover from way back. I am in love with losers and laughter. I am in love with freedom and children. Love is my sword and truth is my compass. What is left? One of the other things that I found to be interesting was that Asada, like most of us, hated capitalism. She talks about working. She said, I was one of those slaves where you pay a fifth of your salary for taxes, some more for Social Security, another $5 a month for union dues, and the rest was not even enough to die on. And that sent me, I don't know, that sent me so much. But she hated capitalism, hated working. And I definitely feel that. But what was also kind of like fascinating was that she talks about her introductions to communism in this chapter. Sada learned communism from African students at Columbia University. While interacting with these students, she begins to more fully critique the US education system. And she then instructs that there is a deep importance in learning and discerning information for oneself. Even this podcast, even me like walking through the highlights of this book. And when I tell you I'm sharing like a third of what I wish I could discuss, like I feel like a book club would be a fun thing to do. But even me doing this, right, is not the same thing as you reading this text for yourself and understanding and learning and discerning for yourself. So do that if you are willing and able. And for Asada, it's important to do this because she realized she was like, wait, like they had me fucked up my whole life. And she says, quote, only a fool lets somebody else tell him who his enemy is. It's got to be one of the most basic principles of living. Always decide who your enemies are for yourself and never let your enemies choose your enemies for you. Also thought as like something that was just really interesting and really funny. After she was like, "Oh, yeah, no, fuck these jobs." She would like make up stuff on her resume and just show up to work and they would be like, "Oh, we got to do a background check." And sometimes they would do a background check and realize that she was pretending, or other times they would be like, "Oh, yeah, you passed a background check." And she'd be like, "Oh, this shit is not real. Like none of this shit is real." And I think I don't know, part of me is like, was she a Sag Moon or something? Because why why was she so into the fuck around and find out? Like, but she did that and came back to tell us the story of it, which is like, none of this shit is real. One of the other things that I found interesting in her autobiography were her descriptions of the Black Liberation Army, in particular, the ways that she lets us know that they are more or less the anarchist formation. We learn a bit more about them in chapter 11 after she learns about one of her comrades dying, trying to escape prison. She in court, she makes the opening statement. Because one of the other things that she did was like, she also represented herself in court. Like, she was really much like, y'all not about to have me out here fucked up. I'm involved in every part of this process. But she talks about the Black Liberation Army and she says, the Black Liberation Army is not an organization. It goes beyond that. It is a concept, a people's movement, an idea. Many different people have said and done many different things in the name of the Black Liberation Army. The idea of a Black Liberation Army emerged from conditions in Black communities, conditions of poverty, indecent housing, massive unemployment, poor medical care, and inferior education. The idea came about because Black people are not free or equal in this country. The concept of the BLA arose because of the political, social, and economic oppression of Black people in this country. And where there is oppression, there will be resistance. The BLA is part of that resistance movement. The Black Liberation Army stands for freedom and justice for all people. And so, if we think about movements and we think about the way that movements might function today, the effective ones are the ones that are rooted in the lived conditions of the people. They also are fairly decentralized. One of the things that's also important for us to note here is that even in the face of what could be the end, Asada continues to have a voice. She really is not going to allow them to kill her silently. And that is just so inspiring. She also talks a bit about hair and the politics of hair. And she says, people are right when they say it's not what you have on your head, but what you have in it. You can be a revolutionary thinking person and have your hair fried up, and you can have an afro and be a traitor to Black people. But for me, how you dress and how you look have always reflected what you have to say about yourself. When you wear your hair a certain way or when you wear a certain type of clothes, you are making a statement about yourself. When you go through all your life processing and abusing your hair so it will look like the hair of another race of people, then you are making a statement and the statement is clear. I don't care if it's the curly conch, latex locks, or whatever. You're making a statement. It was a matter of a simple statement for me. This is who I am, and this is how I like to look. This is what I think is beautiful. You can spend a lifetime discovering African style hairdresses. There are so many of them, and so many creative natural styles yet to be invented. For me, it was important not just because of how good it made me feel, but because of the world in which I live. In a country that is trying to completely negate the image of Black people, that constantly tells us we are nothing, our culture is nothing. I felt and still feel that we have got to constantly make positive statements about ourselves. Our desire to be free has got to manifest itself in everything we are and do. So, like I said, the rest of the book, the timelines begin to overlap, and she starts to describe her political consciousness journey, where she calls becoming more active as what allowed her to control her life. She saw through the different groups on her college campus that folks were reading theory but not practicing, or they were practicing without reading theory and history. So the practice wasn't grounded in anything substantial. And in this time, she learned about the importance of being with the people. And that is what would eventually draw her to the Black Panther Party. But she says here, no movement can survive unless it is constantly growing and changing with the times. If it isn't growing, it's stagnant. Without the support of the people, no movement for liberation can exist, no matter how correct its analysis of the situation is. That's why political work and organizing are so important. Unless you are addressing the issues people are concerned about and contributing positive direction, they'll never support you. The first thing the enemy tries to do is isolate revolutionaries from the masses of people, making us horrible and hideous monsters so that our people will hate us. The schools we go to are reflections of the society that created them. If nobody is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. As long as we expect America's schools to educate us, we will remain ignorant. I think another moment where Asada Shakur displays a ruthless self devotion is when she chooses her name. She says, I wanted a name that had something to do with struggle, something to do with the liberation of our people. I decided on Asada Olumbala Shakur. Asada means she who struggles. Olumbala means love for the people. And I took the name Shakur out of respect for Zaid and Zaid's family. Shakur means the thankful. She changes her name after meeting up with the folks in the Golden Drum Society. She learns the importance of a kind of political education that is both consciousness raising, but also radicalizing and politicizing. She critiques the left and the hierarchies within as well. As I was reading this for the second time to prepare for the podcast, it just made me think about all those horrible ass, miserable ass bitches tried to keep us from gatekeeping grief, as they named it around Asada. These were folks who mostly black, who are liberals, if that, maybe centrist, maybe conservative, but people get real funky around death. And some of my research, or really the bulk of my research, talks about that, particularly when it comes to Black women. And people want to be able to project onto them. But she sort of learns more about communism and socialism through reading the works of guerrilla groups in South and Central America. She starts to read the work of Mao, of Lenin, Marx. She refines her own understanding of socialism and capitalism. And she says there was not a single liberation movement in Africa that was not fighting for socialism. In fact, there was not a single liberation movement in the whole world that was fighting for capitalism. And she says one of my favorite things about the communist and socialist theorists that I just found to be so funny. And it also kind of speaks to some of my gripes with communism and socialism and how it's rehearsed in these different formations. She says, I had begun to think of myself as a socialist, but I could not in any way see myself joining any of the socialist groups I came in contact with. I loved to listen to them, learn from them, and argue with them, but there was no way in the world I could see myself becoming a member. For one thing, I could not stand the condescending, paternalistic attitudes of some of the white people in those groups. Some of the older members thought that because they had been in the struggle for socialism for a long time, they knew all the answers to the problems of Black people and all the aspects of the Black liberation struggle. I couldn't relate to the idea of the great white father on earth any more than I could relate to the great white father up in the sky. I was willing and ready to learn everything I could from them, but I damn sure was not ready to accept them as leaders of the Black liberation struggle. And, this is how Marxists, et cetera, be acting. She makes this really astute point about white leftists that I think we need to continue to hold on to in our present day. And she says, arrogance was one of the key factors that kept the white left so factionalized. I felt that instead of fighting together against a common enemy, they wasted time quarreling with each other about who had the right line. Although I respected the work and political positions of many groups on the left, I felt it was necessary for Black people to come together to organize our own structures and our own revolutionary political party. Friendship is based on respect. As long as the white left saw their role as organizing, educating, recruiting, and directing Black revolutionaries, I could not see how any real friendship could occur. I felt, and still feel, that it is necessary for Black revolutionaries to come together, analyze our history, our present condition, and to define ourselves and our struggle. Black self-determination is a basic right, and if we do not have the right to determine our destinies, then who does? I believe that to gain our liberation, we must come from the position of power and unity, and that a Black Revolutionary Party, led by Black revolutionary leaders, is essential. I believe in uniting with white revolutionaries to fight against a common enemy, but I was convinced that it had to be on the basis of power and unity, rather than weakness and unity at any cost. So the next poem that I found to be really interesting that Asada shares with us is entitled To My Mama. To my mama, who has swallowed the American dream and choked on it. To my mama, whose dreams have fought each other and died, who sees but cannot bear to see, a volcano eating its own lava. To my mama, who couldn't turn hell into paradise and blamed herself, who is always seen reflected in her mirror an ugly duckling. To my mama, who makes no demands of anyone because she don't think she can afford to, who thinks her money talks louder than her womanhood. To my butchfin mama, who is always taking care of business, who has never drifted hazily to sleep thinking, he will take care of it, who has schemed so much, she sometimes schemes against herself. To my sweet, shy mama, who is uneasy with people because she don't know how to be phony and is afraid to be real, who has longed for sculptured gardens, whose potted plant dies slowly on the windowsill. We have all been infected with a sickness that can be traced back to the auction block. You must not feel guilty for what has been done to us. Only the strong go crazy. The weak just go along. And what I thought was cruelty, I understand was fear that hands, stronger than yours and whiter than yours, would strangle my young life into oblivion. Mama, I am proud of you. I look at you and see the strength of our people. I have seen you struggle in the dark, the world beating on your back, dragging your catch back to our den, pulling your pots and pans out to cook it, a mop in one hand, a pencil in the other, marking up my homework with your love. The injured have no blame. Let it fall on those who injure. Leave the past behind where it belongs and come with me toward tomorrow. I love you, Mommy, 'cause you are beautiful, and I am life that springs from you. Part tree, part weed, part flower. My roots run deep. I have been nourished well. So beautiful. On page 197, Asada asserts that she was a socialist. She says, to me, the revolutionary struggle of Black people had to be against racism, capitalism, imperialism, and sexism, and for real freedom under a socialist government. But the reality of achieving it seemed a way off. And so here she kicks off her journey of traveling to the West Coast to meet the Black Panthers and to meet other revolutionary groups. She pursues that change of scenery that she loves so much. And we eventually find her getting high in the park with some friends, which I'm sure some of us listening have done. But it was in that moment where she realized that she needed to change because the police could have arrested them if the Red Guard hadn't saved them. And so she says, it was obvious my stuff was raggedy and that I needed to get my act together. If I wanted to call myself a revolutionary, I was going to have to earn the title. I had heard somebody say that revolutionaries get a high on revolution, that it was the best high in the world. I'm going to check out that high, I said aloud. Huh? What did you say? Nothing, I answered. I was just talking out loud. Somebody said, I could dig it. We stopped off at a coffee shop and had some tea. Everybody looked sheepish and lost in their thoughts. Finally, we waved our goodbyes and made our separate ways. I walked back to where I was staying, wondering where I was going, what I was going to have to do to become who I needed to become. Revolution is about change, and the first place the change begins is in yourself. She speaks to the truth that we've talked about all throughout this podcast, right? Which is that changing the world starts within. She gives us very little space to really learn about the conditions in which she was learning and living immediately before her arrest. We do get to read her capture by the state. We do get to read some of her critiques of the Black Panther Party And she critiques them for their gender politics, the arrogance of the leaders. The political education just wasn't right. The leaders were too estranged from the conditions of the people. They were only focused on reading works that weren't by Black people, which is kind of ironic, but they were focused on the Marxist works and not on the works written by Black and African people. And the party, she was continually like dealing with harm in the party. And once the party had caused her enough harm, she left. And she says, I hate arrogance, whether it's white or purple or black. Some people let power go to their heads. They think that just because they have some kind of title in front of their name, you're supposed to bend over and kiss them on the ass. The only great people I've met have been modest and humble. You can't claim that you love people when you don't respect them. And you can't call for political unity unless you practice it in your relationships. And that doesn't happen out of nowhere. That's something that has got to be put into practice every day. And so one of the things that we continually talk about, right, is rehearsing our values. We talk about this in our learning community. What does it mean to actually believe in love and care? What does that look like on the day to day and moment by moment, right? And this is what kills liberation movements. People espouse these ideas. They say they have this vision for the world and for freedom, but they don't know how to interact with other people. And so her underscoring this was really important. And she talks about how the party would condemn people for criticisms. They would condemn people for speaking out against certain leaders in the party. They even turned against each other. It's actually quite the telenovela if you're into that. She does say criticism and self-criticism were not encouraged, and the little that was given often was not taken seriously. Constructive criticism and self criticism are extremely important for any revolutionary organization. Without them, people tend to drown in their mistakes, not learn from them. What initially had brought her to the Black Panther Party was what she describes as the beautiful creativity of the organization and of the group. And after being infiltrated by the FBI, after all the egos got involved, after all of the harm that she experienced and the intentional sabotage by COINTELPRO and the federal government, she felt like everything that she loved about the party was gone. She had to leave. But what was a bright spot for her about struggle and what will like end this reading of her work with is this. Because it can be hard to imagine, like, how does one survive this? How does one survive the FBI, CIA? Like, how does one continue to do this work? And so I think she describes it beautifully here. She says, one of the best things about struggling is the people you meet. Before I became involved, I never dreamed such beautiful people existed. Of course, there were some creeps, but I can say without the slightest hesitation that I have been blessed with meeting some of the kindest, most courageous, most principled, most informed, and intelligent people on the face of the earth. I owe a great deal to those who have helped me, loved me, taught me, and pulled my coat when I was moving in the wrong direction. If there is such a thing as luck, I've had an abundance of it, and the ones who have brought it to me are my friends and comrades, my wild, big-hearted friends, with their pretty ways and pretty thoughts, have given me more happiness than I will ever deserve. There was never a time, no matter what horrible thing I was undergoing, when I felt completely alone. Maybe it's ironic, I don't know. But the one thing I do know is that the Black liberation movement has done more for me than I will ever be able to do for it. Thank you, Asada. Thank you for leaving us with the gift of your revolutionary power, your revolutionary praxis, your autobiography, your words, your teachings, your guidance. Thank you. You have given us so much. You have seeded for us a revolutionary spirit. Thank you for choosing to be visible in your state of structural vulnerability as a Black woman, as a revolutionary, and as a political prisoner, as someone in exile. She could have chosen to fade into obscurity, but instead, she chose to allow us to see her. So the question is now, what will you choose? How will we integrate the knowledge from these two ancestors? This is what we'll end the podcast on today. I have a few ideas and a set of reflections and meditations based on Asada Shakur's and Audre Lorde or Gamba Adisa's work. Audre Lorde talks about the women in her life providing the care and concern that was needed for her to be able to, quote, scrutinize the essentials of my living, end quote. She says, quote, the women who sustained me through that period were Black and white, old and young, lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual, and we all shared a war against the tyrannies of silence. They all gave me a strength and concern without which I could not have survived intact. Within those weeks of acute fear came the knowledge, within the war we are all waging with the forces of death, subtle and otherwise, conscious or not, I am not only a casualty, I am also a warrior. Throughout her book, Asada Shakur also talks about the power of women in her life who came to save her. This community that constitutes that fortitude. For us, it's important to think about it in this way, recognizing that though our oppressors may have slaughtered us to be a casualty, though they may have created the conditions for our lives to be akin to death, it isn't. We aren't dead. So what will you do to survive, knowing that surviving, that living in ruthless self-devotion, that tending to yourself and to your community is enough? Who enables you to have the strength, the care, and the concern that you need to be able to look at your life and discern what you need to speak and to be seen? What do you need to feel brave because you may never feel safe to speak? What do you need to feel brave because you may never be safe to be seen? What are the ways that you desire to be more visible? What are the ways that you desire to be more vulnerable? In Audre Lorde's words, quote, what are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you sicken and die of them, still in silence? Another thing to think about that this will inevitably lead you to is, who are you really? And not in that weird bypassy, we're all human beings, self-definition, right? But more so in seeing yourself outside of the forms of representation that your oppressor has offered you. If you move past those entities or clouds or things that might disrupt the visibility of you in your own life, right? And make you not visible to others, those cloaks, right? What parts of you do you discover that desire, that life-saving visibility? What parts of you haven't we seen yet that we aren't able to love on because we don't know exist? And how can you tend to these parts without resorting to representation, your oppressor's aspartame offering? Once you've thought about who you are, then it's time to think about the work that you've come here to do. If this is who you are, then what is the work that you have come here to do? What is the work that you will do, regardless of who may fear you? Audre Lorde describes herself and says, quote, "Perhaps for some of you here today, I am the face of one of your fears because I am woman, because I am Black, because I am lesbian, because I am myself, a Black woman warrior poet doing my work, come to ask you, are you doing yours? And well, are you?" And if we come back to what Audre Lorde says about fear and its relationship to silence, right? In the cause of silence, each of us draws the face of her own fear, fear of contempt, of censure, or some judgment or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation. But most of all, I think we fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. What are the faces of your fear? Write them down. The list might be long. It might have a few people on it. I know mine definitely does. And think, how will you be determined to speak even as you face these fears? Because the truth is, you were purposed for a moment such as this. All of you deserves to be visible. All of you deserves to be known, to be seen, and to be loved, especially and primarily by you. And now that you've examined the faces of your fear, what is your commitment to yourself? Again, we meet Audre Lorde in her wisdom, where she says, "In the transformation of silence into language and action, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation and to recognize her role as vital within that transformation." So, how will you transform your silence into language and action? What is your role in transforming that in community with others? I don't know. If you're like me, you be talking about these kind of stuff with a close friend. So you might ask them, how do I show up in the world that allows you to have what you need to speak and to be seen? And if you might show up in the world in a way that you don't necessarily like, you might reflect on what that role has cost you. What have you lost? What have you had to push away and not allow to be seen? What are the ways in which you've had to not acknowledge your own ability to be wounded? And also, what good has that role brought to your life? The only way out of what we're experiencing right now is through. No one's going to save us. And we have to begin to practice those skills that we want to exhibit in the world that we see, right? We have to rehearse them. And so if we recall, Audre Lorde talks about learning to speak when we are afraid because we've been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And so what are the ways that you can practice speaking in fear in small everyday ways? Or we can go back to Asada Shakur's example of her grandmother forcing her to go to the store and demanding to get the right thing until she receives what she needs, facing those small moments where we swallow our words, swallow our needs out of fear. And perhaps you might start with expressing your needs at work or expressing them at school, expressing them in a relationship with your family members, practicing creating your own conditions of safety for your vulnerability, exposing yourself potentially to be wounded, yes, but also to be seen. One thing that I want to add finally, and I'm going to try my best not to be too shady, but I think it's important to recognize, right, as we're thinking about visibility, vulnerability, representation, and the way that reality is being conjured, reconjured, and reconstituted in front of us, even now, right, is that folks are going to be ramping up towards the 2026 election cycle. They'll call what happened last week a victory, quote unquote, for Democrats, hope and evidence that we can in fact continue to invest in these systems and change them from within. But we have seen enough to know that that's not true. But they're going to continue to ramp this up. They're going to say, that these elections are the fight for our lives. But baby, here we are. The booth has come and gone, and the fight is still on, no? They will tell us that divestment from forms of civic engagement, that our self-betrayal is not practical, nor is it quote unquote pragmatic. And I'll just share something that I shared on IG Live about the difference between pragmatism and practicality, because as anarchists and abolitionists, we always want to be practical, but we never want to be pragmatic. And we want to be sure to assess whether the political strategies that were being offered are actually based on fear's first cousin, which is pragmatism. And so this is how I like to think about it. Pragmatism will always be an enemy to liberation because it assumes that the resources you have now, the power that you have now, and the space that you have now will never change. Pragmatism is stagnancy. It is born from scarcity. It's born from a place of lack. To be pragmatic is to say, well, if things never change, this is what I can get here and now and what I hold on to. Practicality, on the other hand, takes what you have in the moment and makes it useful. So practicality says, okay, we might not have 2 potatoes and cheese and rice in the cabinet, but we got 1 potato, a little sprinkle of cheese, and some grits. I mean, that sounds like a really weird meal, but a practical person is going to say, let me figure out how to make this work for now. And then when I get something different later, I'll get that different thing later. A pragmatic person says, this is what I have. How can I portion and ration what I have? Because things might not change in the future. Practicality is more of an abundant mindset, not a scarcity one. Pragmatism assumes that you will only have what you have now for the foreseeable future. To double down, right? Another example that I use to think about this is like Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey, if she were being pragmatic, she would have stopped singing immediately after Nick Cannon took her voice, right? Like when things were a little shifty there 10 or so years ago, like she would have said, you know what? The pragmatic thing to do in this moment would be to retire, would be to let it go, to stop singing, to ride on the coattails of my best album, The Emancipation of Mimi, and make my money. But she took a practical approach. She said, I might not have been who I was. I might not be able to hit the notes that I was able to hit before. But what can I do now? How can I shift things now? And I think that approach is what will be necessary for us moving forward. We may never again get the literal blood money and the other resource allocation that was given in 2020 out of guilt. We may never have DEI, whatever the fuck that is, back. We may never be able to have the quote unquote rights, the quote unquote progress that we had in the past. But that does not mean that we need to continue to concede to the demands of our oppressors. That does not mean that things will always be this way. One thing I know for sure is that things will never be what they were. And as long as we continue to choose to be visible and vulnerable in our communities, to be ruthlessly devoted to ourselves and to our practices and to each other, we will survive this. I don't know who needs to hear this, but you will survive this. But the only way that you will be able to see a new future, the only way that you will be able to truly, 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 truly live in the fullness of the glory that is your destiny is to trust that the worst, that the cloaking, that the veiling, that the false shields that you put up around the core of who you are can fall, and that community will be there to hold you. Well, that's all I got for y'all today. It's a lot. Take it as, I missed 3 episodes, so 3 episodes worth of stuff. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope that this episode gives you permission to be vulnerable and visible, even while holding the fear of having your truths and your body, spirit, mind bruised. We need to see you so that you can survive. I want to express my deepest gratitude to my elevated ancestors and spirit guides, to the Most High God for giving me the inspiration and the fortitude to do this work. I do not take it lightly. I also want to thank Jemiah Jacob, Love Free's community coordinator, for her work. And if you want to keep up with future episodes, be sure to follow us on Instagram. If you aren't following us on Instagram, you're really missing out because we be doing a lot of shit on there. And subscribe to our Substack and our YouTube page. Be sure to give us 5 stars and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps us reach other listeners. And if you're listening on Spotify, leave us a comment to let us know what you think of the episode. If you would like to give us feedback, send us an email at black.loved.free@gmail.com. And if this episode touched you or made you think differently about something, let us know. If you want to donate to the podcast, we'll leave the link in the show notes. Your donations literally keep the website up. Doesn't keep the lights on because my job does that, but it does keep the website up and running. And lastly, may you find a sacred, soft place to care for yourselves and for each other. May you radiate in the truth that you are the one who saves you. And may you find the strength to be Black, loved, and free. Until next time, bye.